All right, like we mentioned, she's a fantastic reporter, political reporter over at NPR, and that is Deepa Shivaram. Deepa, Mike Leon, Nick Savary, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me.
Deepa, I was reading your article and listening to your fantastic voice earlier today on that piece that you did. And it's kind of why I reached out to you to invite you on the program, because before we get into all of that, I wanted to get into the high level 30,000 foot view of, for people that may have not caught up with everything that's happened from, the draft opinion being released and leaked to Politico, to the confirmation from Justice Roberts of its authenticity, to what this means about women's rights and what states may enact laws once this is overturned. Can you give a 30,000 foot view summation for our audience that's tuning into this?
Yeah, I'll try to. Okay, so we saw earlier this week, Monday night, this draft opinion from Justice Alito that was released and published in Politico. It was a leaked report. This is really not the norm. This is not something that happens. The Supreme Court of the United States is something that, as part of its, almost legitimacy, is an institution that doesn't see the kind of leaking and the kind of, back and forth comms shop stuff that happens with the White House and Capitol Hill, for example. The Supreme Court is pretty locked down when it comes to this kind of stuff. And so to see a leaked report of a draft opinion before it is even released or anything like that is pretty extraordinary. So that really rocked a lot with this decision over Roe, and also just the fact that it was leaked in the first place. So that's kind of two separate things going on. The opinion from Justice Alito, the draft opinion, I should say, essentially says that the court is posed to roll back the protections of abortion rights that were outlined in the 1973 Supreme Court case of Roe v. Wade. That has been the Supreme Court law of the land to protect the right to an abortion in this country since 1973. A 1992 case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey was another abortion case that upheld the Roe decision, but kind of changed things around, and we can get that into that a little bit later. But all of that to say, this is a huge shift in what the court has said for a long time about the right to an abortion, and that really rocked a lot of what folks have been talking about and saying for a long time. It's kind of hard to say you could be shocked by this, given a lot of the other cases that have been brought up, given the justices that President Trump has put on the court, and a lot of the legal conversations that have been going on. This is not exactly unexpected, but it is still really shocking nonetheless. And so that's what you saw happen Monday night. Pretty much immediately, there were protests outside the Supreme Court and throughout DC. Folks on Tuesday coming in who were both pro-abortion and anti-abortion, all kind of culminating outside of the Supreme Court. And what you've seen from politicians is Democrats, people like Chuck Schumer, who's the Senate Majority Leader, vowing to kind of put this to a vote in Congress, because Congress has not codified on a legislative level the protections of abortion, the right to an abortion. And so that kind of sort of has taken a political turn as well, where a lot of Republicans haven't really said much except talk about how egregious this leak was. And then Democrats have been saying that, every senator in the United States Senate needs to have their vote on this put on the record. And then from the White House, you've seen a little bit of like a righteous anger from Vice President Kamala Harris. And you've seen Joe Biden himself also talk about a little bit about what this means for other protections as well. Things like same-sex marriage, things like access to birth control. There's a lot on the line here if the Supreme Court were to move forward with this exact draft opinion and revoke Roe versus Wade.
Deepa, you mentioned both cases, obviously the Roe case and the Casey decision as well. For our audience, Supreme Court decisions are a little like the game of telephone. Like from the moment that decisions pass, over time, we tend to forget the impact, but also what is the actual legal standing, that came out of that precedent. Could you take us through from the Roe decision through Casey, what became, as you put it, the law of the land, to just help put context into what the decision is, what Casey sort of speaks to, and where we are now with what that decision's impact is?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in. And, I'm not a constitutional scholar. I'm not a legal scholar. So this is to the best of my understanding, right? With the caveat that I am by no means an expert on any of this. But Roe v. Wade essentially established a protection to abortion, and it set up something called the trimester framework. And so the way we think about pregnancy, right? So for a pregnant person, you have the first trimester, second trimester, and third trimester. Roe v. Wade said that within the first trimester of a pregnancy, the pregnant person had a right to an abortion and could seek an abortion. The second trimester, you can kind of allow states to start adding restrictions and regulations on when a fetus could be aborted. And by the third trimester, it was pretty much agreed upon in Roe that you would not really have access to abort the fetus unless there was like a reason to protect the life of the pregnant person and the life of the mother. And so that was kind of the very general overview of what the trimester framework set up in Roe v. Wade. You have to understand also that like pre-1973, like pre-Roe v. Wade, abortion was not legal in this country. And states slowly throughout like the 60s and like into the early 1970s, when you see Roe v. Wade pass, there were some states that started to loosen up their abortion restrictions. And so that's kind of where the country stood before Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973. It wasn't really something that was really rallied about or politicized or talked about the way it is today. It was kind of this thing that was sort of happening in the background, and Roe v. Wade really put abortion front and center into a national movement. And so that was what happened in 1973. After that decision, you saw a lot of states kind of try to like futz with things and sort of see like where do these legal protections really stand? Like how far could we really go here? And that takes you up to Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey. And that was a case out of Pennsylvania where in the late 80s, the state of Pennsylvania changed their abortion laws. And they said they started adding these like little restrictions here and there on when a pregnant person, would be allowed to get an abortion. There was things like a 24-hour waiting period. There was a law that they had in there about if you were a minor, you had to get a parental permission, essentially, or you had parental consent to get an abortion. They had a clause in there that was talking about how if you were a married woman, you had to basically say or like confirm that you had communicated with your spouse, your husband, that you had an intent to get an abortion. And so they had changed all of these little laws, and that added restrictions. It made it harder essentially to get an abortion. That went up through a district court, and the district court in Pennsylvania ruled that those changes were unconstitutional, that it violated Roe v. Wade. It then went to an appellate court, and this is a crazy fun fact. There was a judge on that appellate court, and that judge was Samuel Alito, the same judge who is now sitting on the Supreme Court with this draft opinion. The world just works in funny ways.
Wow.
And so that case went up to the appellate court, and the appellate court both affirmed and kind of like negated some of what the district court said. So the appellate court said that, some of these restrictions, they're fine. But the clause about a married woman having to seek permission essentially from her husband was unconstitutional. And then that appellate court decision went up to the Supreme Court, and it was argued in front of the Supreme Court in 1992. And that decision essentially changed things a little bit, because the thing to keep in mind about Casey is that it upheld Roe. It said that Roe v. Wade is the law of the land, and we are not negating that. But it created this clause or this phrase that you should keep in mind that's called undue burden. And it said that restrictions, regulations around when a person could get an abortion were allowable if it did not cause an undue burden on the person seeking an abortion. If you're wondering, what does an undue burden mean? That's a great question. I had the same question. A lot of people have the same question. And the reality is that that's up to different judges around the country to decide what that means. An undue burden is essentially like the way it's framed is like, obstacles. The word obstacle is used in that decision of like, if there is something in the way of your path, if you are seeking an abortion, that is an undue burden. Here's the problem: when you apply that in society, a, a burden for someone who is wealthy, has access to a car, has, access to a nearby abortion clinic, is not going to be the same burden that someone who is rural, in a rural area, who's poorer, who doesn't have access to a vehicle. Like, there's so many different things that determine whether something is a burden or not. And the law is not exactly applied equally in those cases. And so that is basically 1973, Roe v. Wade was a huge pivotal moment when it comes to abortion and access to abortion and abortion rights in this country. But Casey really reframed a lot of that. And this ability to frame the abortion rights conversation in terms of this undue burden is really where things have stood since 1992. So basically, the whole trimester framework was negated. They took that out and they created this undue burden way of making decisions about abortion rights. And that has really opened the door for this massive gray area for all of these states to pass things like 24-hour waiting periods, 72-hour waiting periods. There are some restrictions in states about, you need to have a second doctor come in and allow the abortion to happen, or, hospitals have to have certain regulations, parental consents, informed consents. There's all these different barriers now that are added in. And these judges on individual levels are deciding whether or not that's an undue burden. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that kind of takes you through a little bit of the progress here from like what the abortion movement and the anti-abortion movement, looked like pre-Roe v. Wade up until Casey, and how that's really impacted abortion access in the past, 20 years.
Deepa, and by the way, you can read Deepa's recent article on the history of anti-abortion rights, even though she gave you that fantastic summation there, but go check it out on NPR.com. I wanted to ask you, because we've had a few people on from the different media outlets, and I was watching one of them, Mike Emanuel, a chief Washington correspondent over at Fox News. And he was talking about a recent Fox poll that shows 63% of Fox News poll, Deepa, by the way, former Fox News producer, you're looking at one right here. So a Fox poll showed 63% of people feel Roe v. Wade should stand as is. Only 27% of people want to overturn it. Trump carried 46% of the popular vote. So it's safe to say that there are some people within that circular group that are probably pro-choice, people that are Trump supporters. How does someone like me make sense of all that? How would you make sense of all of that? That 63% of people feel from this poll that Roe v. Wade should stand as is. And then on the second part, the worst thing to do, a two-part question for you. How do you think this will play into the midterms?
Yeah, those are both really good questions. I have not seen that Fox News poll, so I can't really talk on that specifically, but I can say that overall polling, and this is a number of polls, this is not just one poll. NPR has done polling on this, ABC has done polling on this, the Washington Post has done polling on this, show again and again and again that overturning Roe versus Wade is not a popular decision in this country. A majority of Americans, over 50%, support keeping Roe versus Wade. There was also polling to show that Americans, despite the fact that they support theoretically what Roe versus Wade is saying, also support some restrictions on abortion. So when you look at those numbers, it's not, 57%, like you said, whatever the Fox News poll said, or 54%, which is somewhat some other polls are saying. It's not, the number doesn't necessarily mean that everyone supports abortion without any restrictions. You have to keep in mind that people also pretty overwhelmingly favor some kind of restrictions on abortion, which, keep in mind, is something that Roe laid out already. Like, Roe was not saying unrestricted abortion in this country is the law of the land. There were restrictions set up within Roe, like we talked about with that trimester framework. And so it is interesting because the court right now, with this draft opinion, if that becomes the final decision, is not doing something that tracks with public opinion. And that's really interesting to keep in mind, because when you look at Planned Parenthood versus Casey, if you read through that decision, there's a part of it that talks specifically about how it might not be popular to uphold Roe, but the court has to do what is like legally best, right? They write about this in the decision that it might not be politically popular, it might not be socially popular, but that is not the role of the Supreme Court. Their role is to interpret the law to the best of their abilities, and their interpretation in 1992 was to uphold Roe v. Wade as the law of the land. And so even though it was politically unpopular at that point, and maybe people weren't as, supportive, they recognized the institution of the Supreme Court. These justices recognized that was not their job. Their job was not to do what was politically popular. Their job was to interpret legal precedent. And, it is very uncommon for the court to sort of deviate on what they call stare decisis, which is abiding by the precedent that the court has already set. And that's what Casey did with Roe. They changed some things around. There was some added things with this whole undue burden situation, but they upheld Roe as the law of the land. And so to see this draft opinion from Alito to completely negate not one previous Supreme Court ruling, but two with both Casey and Roe is pretty extraordinary. And so it is difficult to interpret that as a regular person who's maybe seeing this happen and also seeing these poll numbers. It doesn't really square, and it's not normal. I think that's important to point out, that this is not really a typical situation that's going on. So keep that in mind as you see more of the polling with public opinion, and I'm sure we'll see more polls come out about this. The other question you had, I might need you to repeat it. Oh, midterms. Yeah, this is really interesting. And it's a little too soon to say. I'm someone who prefers to have the whole picture before you sort of start throwing theories out there, because again, this is still a draft opinion. We don't have an official ruling from the court. But so far, you've seen, like I said before, you've seen Democrats sort of say, like, we need, every senator to make clear where they stand on this. If you saw Elizabeth Warren's speech outside the Supreme Court the other day, I covered her primary campaign, and it is a rare day that you see her get as animated. And, she's a very passionate person. She's very fired up, but that was definitely a different flavor of Elizabeth Warren that we saw this week. And so you see the kind of anger from some more progressive members of the party. And then you see Republicans who are spending their time talking about this leak, and they're really kind of highlighting that a little bit more. I did speak to some people earlier this week who did talk a little bit about the potential political fallout for this. And their argument is that abortion and the topic of abortion and restricting abortion has been a huge issue for a lot of single issue Republican voters. They come out and they vote in elections because of abortion. They are extremely passionate about this issue. And so there is theoretically a world in which maybe fewer Republicans turn out and in the same numbers that they would have in the past because, maybe they perceive this abortion battle as already having been successful. I would be a little bit cautious about that perspective. I think it's a little bit too soon to say. And as we know, in a midterm election, it usually doesn't fare well for the party that's in the White House. So Republicans already have that going for them. And at the same time, we're seeing mass inflation and a lot of other issues, and the economy's not doing great. And there's like a lot to talk about, and a lot that, conservative voters could still get really fired up about. And so I don't think you can really peg any kind of decisions on one issue, but it definitely will be interesting to see, I think, on both sides, like how voters respond to this and see what happens once the ruling really does come out and it's no longer a draft.
Deepa, one of the things I liked about an article you wrote recently about really the history, not just of the decision, but of the anti-abortion movement in this country. Something I wonder about as I read it is, was there consistency in that movement of beyond abortion, because this seems to come down to a pro-life or the advancement of the quality of life argument? But did that argument for them or these folks seem consistent with also opposing, say, the death penalty or poverty or hunger, things like that? I was just curious, in your reporting as you were sharing the timeline, like, did these folks, were they really about that life in terms of ensuring that, all people had, the opportunity to live a better life?
It's been really interesting to track that movement a little bit, because they themselves as a movement have also really like shifted here and there, like between religious leaders and political leaders, in terms of their like messaging, right? Because it's not like like the way that they sort of, you know, who they place the blame on, like you know, it's really interesting to kind of watch how that has been woven in throughout the history of the anti-abortion movement. And you'll see leaders now and folks who are really passionate about it now, like they don't really blame women the same way they used to, or like, you know, who takes the onus on in that movement has really shifted over time. But you got to keep in mind that like the ultimate goal of the movement um, has never been about, you know, supporting people who are pregnant and you know, maybe aren't economically stable enough to have that child. Like that's not the goal of the movement. They have never been worried about that. Their goal has always been to move towards a ban on abortions. And so, you know, they can offer up a lot of other, I think, rhetoric, but in reality, like you're bringing up all these other issues, and that's not the goal, the primary goal of this movement. They are, I would argue, they're very focused. They're very singularly focused. And so all of these other repercussions that pop up when you do restrict abortion are not really tackled, and you can see that in our politics. I mean, you're not seeing Republicans out here in one foul swoop saying, oh, we should restrict abortion and also support paid family leave.
Yeah. Deepa, listen, you have been fantastic. But before we let you go, I want you to put on that journalist hat one more time, as you're talking to two former journalist grads here from Rutgers University. I've been shocked about this, not so much in the coverage of it, but just that it's been weighted equally. Okay. The leak versus what the contents of the leak are. We know which networks have focused on the former versus the latter. As a journalist who wants to scoop and break news, and you rely on sources for information, what do you make of the equally weighted attention that the leak has garnered versus the contents of the leak?
I'm someone who believes you can walk and chew gum at the same time. I don't think there's a world in which we should look at this and say, well, one is definitely more important than the other, and we should focus all of our time on that. I think people can be working on different stories at the same time. I think that news organizations have a lot of reporters who are working on different things at the same time. Just because I'm reporting on the history of the anti-abortion movement doesn't mean that that my colleagues shouldn't also be reporting on other issues as well, and reporting on this topic in different ways as well. There's a lot of things going on. And people who are consuming news and who are voters and who are, you know, seeking information should be able to seek information on all of the things that are happening. This is a decision that, if it becomes the new, you know, law and new legal precedent, will affect a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And I think as a journalist, the thing that I am most concerned about, and this is something that applies to not just this particular topic, but all topics, is making sure that our reporting is inclusive of all of those people, and the people who are the most marginalized, and the people who don't really get to see their stories maybe showcased, in news coverage, making sure that when we talk about, you know, what this means for people, for pregnant people all over the country, for families all over the country, that we are making our reporting as inclusive as possible. And so that does mean that in a situation like this, and in a reporting cycle like this, that the leak is really a big part of this story. But there are a lot of other parts of this story as well that need to be told.
Deepa Shivaram, she is a fantastic reporter, NPR politics reporter. Please check out her work over at npr.com. Deepa, I can't thank you enough for coming on the program. .org. I knew it was .org. That will get edited out. Deepa, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us today. Truly appreciate it. Continued success to you, and stay safe, please.
Thank you. You guys too.